Well, let me introduce Dr. Grace Chung. She teaches political science at San Diego State University. I know her through her husband, Pierre Essalon, who was my history teacher at San Diego State. And Pierre is specialized in American diplomatic history and especially the Cold War. And Grace and Pierre hosted Daniel Ellsberg in their home. So we got to meet him. He sat right next to me, and that was really exciting. It was fun. Anyway, she'll be speaking about, we asked her to speak before the election on the state of American society and democracy today. And so she'll address all the ferment in our country right now as a political scientist and maybe give us some insight into how we got to this place where we are in 2020. Where you have a congresswoman or somebody, a candidate for Congress in Atlanta who actually believes in the QAnon conspiracy and will very likely get elected. And Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader in the House, is perfectly willing to seat her. And then you had the governor of Michigan almost kidnapped by a group of militias. So we want to know why this is happening today and what effect all the social media is having on our discourse and politics, that kind of thing. So we're asking Dr. Chung to give us insights into our contemporary situation as a political scientist. So that's the topic for today. And also next week, she'll be speaking on human rights. And it's something that we in the Episcopal Church support as well. So that should be an interesting topic too. But for now, let's pray for just a moment and then turn it over to Dr. Chung. Loving God, you call us to use our freedom responsibly. Help us as we come to this election to vote and use our freedom in ways that are good, and help us to increase in our love of our neighbor. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, I'll mute my mic and then we'll turn it over.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Peter, and thank you for the invitation, and wonderful to be here to speak with you all. This is actually a very nice way to, I usually have a quiet Sunday morning, and it's nice to see so many people, right? Even though we're on Zoom. I had our Zoom at SDSU kind of had issues this week, and I lost one of my classes, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, if we didn't have Zoom, it would be, it's hard on the students, but it would be, really, really terrible. So, this technology, we have to be very, very grateful for. Thank you all for being here. And as Peter said, next week I'll be speaking on a new commission that the Secretary of State has set up, and the new directions in human rights that it's trying to shift us towards. And so I'm the director of a program on human rights at SDSU. So I'm really interested in all of these topics that we're talking about. I have prepared for today a PowerPoint presentation. So just to give us a nice set of visuals to go with as we're going through. We will be talking about post-truth. Yes, and as Peter said, the introduction to or some overview of the background to that and its impact on our democracy. Not necessarily, this is not the most pleasant picture. So let's get to this one. Does anyone remember or did anyone see this feature? Anyone know what this is depicting? Any ideas? I'm not trying to give free advertising to a store.
Family that came in, they were what? They weren't going to wear masks. They didn't believe in COVID or something like that.
Yeah, this is so interesting, right? This is a kind of, really, this is a political protest in a Target store in Florida. That took place a few weeks ago. I think the second week of September, on September 15th or so. Yeah, they went in to protest mask all of the restrictions due to COVID. And I thought this was fascinating. I don't know about you, but kind of interesting, right? That first of all, political protest in Target is very interesting. And the people, I mean, there's numerous shots and there's some viral videos. I don't know if you've all seen this. Yeah, how the fervor with which the people who marched through were like, don't believe in any of this nonsense about COVID. And this speaks to just, this is not, of course, this is not entertaining at all, really, but it's very, very fascinating from a political science point of view, like where the post-truth politics takes us very, very broadly, right? Outside just of the normal arenas of politics where we normally talk about and address political questions, into spaces like Target and with issues like, like what we think should be uncontroversial, right? Like scientific issues. So this word post-truth was deemed by Oxford Dictionary's 2016.
Michael, can you shut the door, please? It's conflicting.
Yeah. See, word of the year, because of the usage of that term. And 2016, of course, was the year of the presidential campaign, the year of the last presidential election, and so an intense campaigning. And a great deal of this was the analysis of what was basically, what was being said during the campaign, in the campaigns, that it was characterized by post-truths, that is not referring to objective facts, and where objective facts are not deemed to be really significant, but really more appeals to emotion and not even just emotion, but also beliefs. All right, so we'll talk a bit about this concept. Supposedly, this man here on the bottom right corner, he is a Serbian-American playwright named Steve Tesic, and he wrote an article in The Nation news journal in 1992, and this was about what he felt Americans were feeling about the truth. And he argued that since the Vietnam War, many Americans had come to see the truth as something that was unpleasant, was something that was inconvenient. And he traces kind of the background to our discomfort with the truth to the Vietnam era, when the people in power, people in office were telling us, the American public, one thing about what was happening in Vietnam, but kind of suggesting that we were doing well in these local conflicts, but then Americans then realizing how actually not well we were doing, and how we were not really in a war that was winnable, and all the questions that raised. So he said from then on, we've had a lot of issues with the truth. And this is going back, this is, 92. Wow, when was that? I can barely remember that far back anymore. Clinton? Just about, yeah. So this is going back a while, and this is an article by another writer that came about that year in 2016, when post-truth was proclaimed by Oxford Dictionary to be word of the year. This article really has a great deal to tell us about our present moment, how we got here, and so this is interesting if you would take interest in taking a look at. Kreitner goes through quite a great deal, but actually there's so much written about this. And especially since 2016, both in the public discourse space, like in news journals, but also in academia. There's a good deal of work written about this in academia. As Kesich said, he wrote this in 1992, and he was talking about like the background being in the Vietnam War era, and subsequent to that, with the Iran-Contra scandal under the Reagan administration, under H.W. Bush as well, how presidents handled information that should have been classified and so forth. So this goes way back, but really, why is it until 2016 that we begin to see this term kind of take hold in, this has become such a normal term, such like selfie has become a regular term. And you know, this present administration really reflects that, really reflects this kind of post-truth condition. And even from the very beginning, right, in President Trump's inauguration, this was everyone remember this, going back to January of 2017, the question about the crowds and how, you know, that the White House continued to assert like this was the largest crowd ever, like it was just so well attended and so forth. And the media was kind of like, well, it doesn't seem that well. You know, obviously there's no one at the door counting like in Costco, right? How many people are coming in? But, you know, like the visual evidence suggests otherwise. And so Kellyanne Conway, this infamous term, alternative facts, right? Like, well, we're presenting you with a different set of facts. Okay, that is, you know, the truth isn't one thing, right? There isn't one set of facts. And actually, dictionaries are really getting into this. Merriam-Webster actually tweeted after Kellyanne Conway said, you know, we simply are presenting you with alternative facts. They actually tweeted a definition of facts. They're like, no, this is what facts are, okay? And so dictionaries are getting into this. It's very, very interesting. So very, very recent news. This is the Friday article from New York Times on Friday. Throughout this week, there have been a lot of changes announced by the social media platforms, Twitter, and as well as Facebook. They are going to limit the kinds of information. They're going to flag information that's false. And I think famously after President Trump left the Walter Reed Hospital, he had tweeted something about the COVID, which was, you know, goes against all of the scientific information. So Twitter flagged this. They're also very concerned about, you know, people spreading misinformation further. So they're making it difficult for users to do that. And then, you know, specifically, they are going to, contain what information there is after the election, because of course, this is our big concern, right? And one of the things we'll talk about today is that there's been so much politics over the election itself. You know, will the administration accept the outcome? Or, you know, how will we get the votes counted in time if the post office is hampered, if states are not providing the kind of support for counting the votes, if they're giving limits, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, Twitter has been involved in trying to mitigate what might happen by people falsely, you know, prematurely, you know, proclaiming outcomes before it's made official. And those are specifically, you know, things that we'll talk about afterwards. But President Trump's reaction was, of course, very unpleasant, because Twitter is how he communicates to us, right? But so by Twitter stepping in and saying, we're going to moderate this forum, we're going to block any information that's not, you know, verifiably true. Trump came in and said, you know, this is extremely dangerous for democracy. Okay, so is that the case? I mean, you know, in an abstract sense, right? Somebody who's coming in to moderate a public forum to say what's true and what's false. You know, in an abstract sense, that's, you know, not necessarily untrue, right? And this is one of the reasons why the social media has not wanted to moderate. They're like, you know, we just provide the platform, but we, you know, we're not like the people who say what can and cannot be said in public. Okay, but now we have come to a point where we think it is so potentially dangerous and destabilizing. So, you know, Facebook is doing likewise. Political ads will be banned, and then after polls close, they will not allow for that kind of, premature information about the outcome of the elections to be disseminated. So this takes lots of, many people to work on, but they are very concerned about any potential unrest, okay, that might result from misinformation about the election results. And so, there's, as Peter mentioned earlier, right, there's already been a plot uncovered by, planned by these 13 individuals to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer, and it was a very, very thorough plotting. Incredible. If you'd read, I don't know if you'd read the details of it, but they had, thought about actually so many things, like preventing the authorities from actually accessing her, destroying their access, bridges, so that they can actually rescue the governor and so forth. So there's a lot of concerns about potential political violence, right, that might erupt if there is misinformation about election results. And this is one of the reasons for that Twitter and Facebook have given for implementing these kinds of decisions around this election time. And so, obviously there's different sides to what is going on. And, one of this is a sheriff in Michigan who was defending the people who have been taken into custody for the plot to kidnap the Michigan governor. And he argued that, many people in Michigan want her to be arrested. They believe that she is, she's violating their rights and they don't like her and they want her arrested. And he said, so he questions, like, are these guys, they're not kidnapping, they're making a citizen's arrest is what they suggested. And so he got, of course, a lot of criticism from other parties for that. And, but Michigan was the site of where these armed groups showed up at the legislature to protest some of the policies that the Michigan legislature were reviewing, including the restrictions on COVID. So this was going back to April, I believe. I don't know if you all saw the kind of demonstrations outside the Michigan Capitol building, and they eventually made their way inside with their, arms and surrounded, right, the legislative halls, flooded into there. So, I think this is also another thing that where Trump shows that he is also on a specific side to this, instead of saying something about the kidnapping plot and the dangers that poses. He specifically just criticized the governor for not thanking law enforcement for doing all of that investigation that led to the revealing of the plot. And when in fact she actually did thank law enforcement. And part of that was she was, she did, say some things that were critical to the president, because she's felt that during the election debate, the debate with presidential candidate Joe Biden, he said, stand back and stand down. And some of the other things that he said throughout the presidency, people, and she among them, think that that has been kind of in support of armed uprising. So he, of course, didn't like that. So his tweet was, not to make a statement against those things, but to criticize her. So we see these kinds of sides evolving, and the concerns about this kind of development. This is another group, for example. And as Peter mentioned about QAnon and its influence in politics We have people who are running for office, who are in office, right, who are believers of this QAnon phenomenon, which I think is really, really, it's really super fascinating. It's really not something I ever studied when I was a student, this kind of phenomenon, taking hold, taking hold of so many, such a large segment of society, and over, different people in our, in our government as well. And I was listening to a BBC segment on what its influence in the UK as well. And anyway, it's really quite fascinating. Of course, in the UK, they have a similar concern about the post-truth condition with the Brexit vote, which some of the critics of the Brexit vote have said they attribute that to some of the misinformation. But yeah, this is something, again, we see a very big divide as to QAnon. And, on the one side, the president and some people in the Republican Party are favorable towards it. This past week, the House voted to actually condemn it. They called it, one of the House called it a sick cult. It is, spreading lots of misinformation. So there's a big, because of these different versions of reality that are emerging there are very, very large gaps, right, among our political leadership. And, this is something very concerning because obviously, it seems like, right, there's a lot of efforts to restrict voting and make it difficult to either submit your mail-in ballots with kind of cutoff dates for when they would receive it. And as we know, the post office has been struggling because of changes in that agency. Also in Texas, famously or infamously, the governor had said each county can only have, or each district can only have one drop-off location. And of course, if you look at the differences, right, in the populations, that seems a little bit illogical. And speaking on this, there was a court that ruled that this was not, okay. And I don't know where it went with that. I just, last I saw this on Friday, there was a court that said this is not okay. But then there are other court, there are lots of questions about the election. There's another one where I think South Carolina, where the absentee ballots require, or mail-in ballots require somebody, a witness, to sign. And there are all of these various reasons for this that different states have been implementing. So, this is sort of a reflection of, I think, a real battle that we're seeing over one side being resistant to making the elections open, right, to everybody participating, because these are all, actually taking place in Republican states, right? So I will talk about that because, I mean, as a political scientist, I try always in my classes not to talk in favor of one particular figure or other, in favor of one party or other. I try to criticize every single one, but we'll talk about this, as far as just if you're looking at some of the problematic types of decisions being made about voting, they are all occurring in Republican states. So this is our question today, and this is and beyond that, like so why has that happened? Why is it that there is more of that going on in the red states, and generally what is going on, right, is what the concern is. So we talked about, yeah, this kind of post-truth background context to these very deep divisions within our politics. You know, the commentators have been looking at this for since at least Steve Tetchish's 1992 article, What's Going On. But now, you know, we see that this has become very, you know, this has made it difficult for the two political parties in our country to work in a bipartisan manner. That it seems that it is very difficult for our elected leaders to work together across the aisle these days. And so, you know, David Roberts wrote this of the Vox news outlet, wrote this piece in 2017 where he termed the idea of tribal epistemology. And so this has kind of gained some traction. Various different articles have talked about that, which reflects our epistemic crisis. That, you know, why is it that we have such deep divisions in our politics, and what is its relationship with this idea of post-truth, our post-truth condition? And it's that we have an epistemic crisis. We don't have the same sources of knowledge and information. So we're not just really seeing major differences over the facts, like what does this mean? You know, why are there poor people? You can have different interpretations, right, of why there is persistent poverty in certain communities. There are different valid points of view about that. But our problem is now that we don't even agree on the facts, right? We don't have a basis with which to disagree. You know, so this is something that you can check out. We're going to talk a bit about this idea that David Roberts has come up with, and this is interpreted. So this has made its rounds through a number of different discussions in the media about what's going on, this concept of tribal epistemology. So this is interpreted from another writer, actually a science blogger, Stephen Novella, talking about what does that mean. And I thought he had a good interpretation. You know, the idea that we as human beings tend to use narratives to make sense of the world, right? So before science, you know, going way back, right, there's storytelling about what's happening in the world. And so that's fine if it reflects, you know, to the facts, if it's a way, right, to kind of demonstrate the facts. So I've studied, for example, some people who have long lived in the forest in Sri Lanka, and their ways of, you know, living off the forest. And actually they're extremely sustainable, okay? But they have, you know, they don't talk in the language of modern science, like they haven't been educated in those kinds of formal institutions, but, you know, they do, it's consistent, you know, with their environment, with the reality, their practices. They're able to live well off in the forest while sustaining the forest. And it's adapting to changes in the forest and climate, et cetera. But sometimes when those facts are no longer the root of the narratives, this is the problem, okay? And so this is what Roberts was sort of concluding, that we're actually, the narrative is more important than the facts now. Okay, the narrative, and Novella here, he summarizes the narrative of one, and the institutions of knowledge and legitimacy are failing. No one knows the path forward, but we'll figure it out. Okay, we better figure it out, he says. So the background to this, another one with regards to science, and you might have heard that the Scientific American Journal for the first time ever endorsed a presidential candidate. I mean, they usually have nothing to do with this kind of politics, right? But because of the denial of the formal scientific institutions, Scientific American has endorsed Joe Biden on the basis that Donald Trump seems to reject science. And going back to the 2009 Climate Gate, where the emails of a group of scientists were hacked who worked on climate change, hacked, and then they were pieced together and kind of presented to suggest that they were deliberately misrepresenting their findings so that they can force us to, adopt certain policies that were contrary supposedly to our interests. Then there was a few investigations that showed that this completely was manipulated information. But Climate Gate back in 2009 might be the beginning of this really deep mistrust for science, according to some researchers. And this has led to this kind of denial about the information about COVID-19. So in the middle here we have misspelling, but the protests against Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer, that she is, with the COVID restrictions, being a tyrant, taking away freedoms, and that this was a threat to democracy. And this is because they don't believe, right, in the science behind all of the studies that have suggested we take up social distancing and masking and so forth. They simply do not believe in science as an institution. So instead we call it the China virus, right? And President Trump, when he left, Walter Reed said, I got great medication. I'm going to make it all available to you if you get COVID, and you won't have to pay for it because it's not your fault. It's China's fault. If you get the virus, it's because of China, and China's going to pay for it. So it suggests go on and get COVID. We have the great, pharmaceutical. I don't know how you do that without science, but we have the great, treatments that are available to you. And if you get it, it's not because of your behaviors in social life, but because of China mysteriously giving it to you. Okay, so this is, as I was talking about, I'm always uncomfortable taking any side when I talk about anything, but there have been lots of studies where there is yes, both sides, there are extremists on both left and right. There are people who believe in really, really radical ideas or radical meaning so far from our present set of norms, right, on the left. But it's not symmetrical. It's not even like the extent of extremists on the left and the right. There are more that hold kind of extreme views, radical views on the right, which has been the study of various, subject of various studies. This is a very readable book, Asymmetric Politics. So it's very, very asymmetrical. And it has to do with this kind of attack on institutions of knowledge like science, going back to Climate Gate, as well as some of the other, issues, some of the other institutions of knowledge. This was a poll taken right around the elections, the trust in mass media. Actually, when they broke it down, the difference between people identified as Democrats, Republicans, and independents was really great. Republicans really felt very distrustful of the media. And there was also other studies that about the sources of information in the 2016 election, looking at what voters relied upon. And this was conducted by the Columbia Journalism Review. And they found that, there was really great division, right, among the people who identified as Democrat, Republican, or independent. They found that the sources of information and the institutions that they trust, reflect this conclusion of asymmetric politics. That Democrats by far, people who identify as Democrat by far, trust in traditional institutions of science and so forth. Whereas people in the Republican, they tend not to, and they tend to look to alternative media sources like Breitbart and others, and they tend to really mistrust science and researchers at universities and so forth. So that Columbia Journalism Review also concluded that when they asked about these kinds of the media, it seems that the right-wing media, so those are sources like Breitbart, et cetera, they actually are very consistent in and of itself. Like their narrative is, it's not random, but it makes sense. Like if that's all you pay attention to, it's internally coherent within itself. So it does comprise an alternate perspective on what is happening. It's not, random and doesn't connect with each other. The Columbia Journalism Review conducted suggested that it's actually quite coherent within itself. So what we have is kind of two different what we call epistemic communities. That is, two segments of the population who have different basis for where they get their information, different basis for the information that they work off to make their decisions, to form their opinions, and so forth. So one for whom on this orange part, right, they want evidence, right? They want logic. They trust in institutions of experts like the scientists and trained researchers. And on the other hand, on the white panel, on the white, there's another group who thinks that there's actually, the truth is either based on your position, like truth is only in the eye of the beholder, which is actually something Roger Stone, right, President Trump's former advisor, who would just pardon, he actually had said that, and many people on this side have said that there, the truth is what you think is true, facts. He actually said facts are how you interpret it, or people on this side think that experts and their ways of interpreting what they identify as evidence, how they interpret that evidence, that cannot be trusted. There's just a deep mistrust. So I think this is our big concern, right? Because there is such a gap now, and maybe that gap has roots back in the Vietnam era, like Steve Tatchett says, but it's in fact grown so much. And if we have communities who have such different sets of epistemic standards, okay, how do we judge when there are disputes about information, such as COVID? How do we deal with these really large disputes that we have about in American society today about, what is true and what is not about the COVID-19 pandemic, for example? How do we deal with those disputes if the two sides, don't agree fundamentally on the sources of information? So what criteria, how do we establish whether things are true and others are false? So who has the authority to deal with this? So the concept of the tribal epistemology, they argue that whatever supports our tribe is what I'm going to believe. Okay, so what the information that they will believe is the information that supports their tribe, their group, not the other. So it has very little to do with evidence, logic, or expertise or authority. It's more about taking care of your own who are like you. And you could say, maybe this is why there's a real there's a desire to not let the other side have anything, right? Democratic politics should be about sometimes you win, sometimes we win. We always compromise. Everyone represents people from different walks of life, and people in different walks of life have different interests and concerns. Our politics, right, our public space is to kind of negotiate those differences and come out with something for everyone. But with kind of these what some people consider voter suppression, making it difficult, right, for people's votes to count, it seems that one side just wants to not hear the other side, and that is because in part they don't believe the other side at all. They think that the other side represents, right, things that are just not right. So I think this is what we're seeing with regards to these controversies over just voting and how to count the votes. And then the refusal to hear a nominee from President Obama 10 years before the end of his term, right, saying that we have to wait for the next president, but now insisting that it's okay on this side. Inconsistent, right? I think anybody from an outside who has nothing to do with our government could say, this seems very inconsistent, but it is a demonstration of this kind of tribalism, or what some people call tribalism. Whatever serves our side is okay, because the other side, they view the other side as very dangerous. The other side are full of these corrupt elites in the scientific community, in universities, and traditional media, in Hollywood, and so forth. They simply are very, very mistrustful of those on the other side. So we cannot compromise with them. And how do we get to this kind of condition? Many things. And of course, social media hasn't been around that long, right? I don't do Twitter and Instagram because I don't know how to. Like, it's come about, even Facebook. I'm rarely on. I don't really do social media because it's not my custom. It's not, and I have too many other things to do, I think. But it has been something that people of any generation can get behind, right? I think, and it's something new, and so it adds something new to this equation. If it's, Steve Tesch's writing in 1992 about the post-truth world. We didn't have internet even. Like, I don't think most people had email yet, right? I think that was in the mid-90s. So this throws in a new dimension, and why we've kind of, we could have had this kind of split, but it might have been, in the margins, right, of the people on the different sides. But, some people have talked about social media as a big factor in leading to the split. And so now we see Twitter and Facebook saying, oh, we're going to monitor for misinformation. We're not going to have political ads after the election because we don't want. But actually they are, it's their platform that kind of helped to, some people would say their platforms have helped to create such great deep divisions. Their algorithm for what it is, what kind of information you get, right? They see what you like. They see, oh, you tend to read this kind of politics. You tend to like, these kinds of pastimes, whatever. And they keep feeding you that kind, with the algorithm, keeps directing you, suggesting to you more of that kind of information in order to keep you online, right, on their platform. That's how they make their revenues. They have people there, captive audience, and the advertising, right, shows up. So the longer you stay online, the better it is for their business. So keeping you on there, knowing your interests, right, they can increase, right, the audience and therefore the ad revenues. So, but what happens is we become stuck in these echo chambers where we keep hearing the same thing over and over again. so we're not hearing the other side. I don't know about you all. I have friends who have, who are Trump supporters on social media, and I saw after the debate, a bunch of my friends who are Biden supporters, right, that, if you are a Trump supporter, you're not my friend. If you think it's okay what he said, you're going unfriend, I'm going to unfriend you, and so forth. So people don't want to hear the other side. I like to know what everybody is thinking. I don't want to only hear, preach to the choir and so forth. So people can make those kinds of decisions, but these kinds of media platform, they kind of direct us in that way, so that our thinking is more and more intensely what we believe, and without understanding what others do. Secondly, the media they're not like articles you might read in the New York Review or in, The Nation or whatever you like to read, right? They're very short. Anybody can post, right? They come from a whole variety of sources. They don't require you to reflect. They themselves are not based on reflection. They themselves often aren't based on any fact checking. They just, take something and reproduce it as fact. It is a platform for sound bites, for attention to yourself, right? Selfies, photo ops. You don't have to discuss it with the broader public. It's just a lot of, circulation of different bits and pieces. So this is what the danger is to our current situation, is that, democracy, at least as traditionally we've thought of it, it's something that requires deliberation. It shouldn't be something based on Twitter feeds and, these kinds of just jabs at each other on Twitter, which limits like the number of letters you can use, right? They don't want you to go into long explanations. No one wants to really read that either. And we don't, and democracy also requires faith in institutions. Like, when Al Gore lost the election, he said, well, I have, we have to go up with what our rules are. We must respect our rules, because without and rules are in our institution, right? We don't respect that, then we're going to have, deep problems with our democracy. Okay, so we must all agree on the rules, that the institutions are going to work for all of us, and we're going to, steadily and always stick to those ways of dealing with our different perspectives. When we don't have that, this is why we're seeing even Twitter and Facebook saying, let's limit what's going to be on there this election season, okay? Because we see such a decline in trust in institutions, and we see this really troubling inability to speak to each other, to deliberate on information that affects all of us, and what would be the best thing to do for us. So I will leave it at that. I want to not talk the whole time. Oh, we do have 15 minutes, so I hope that you all have any insights or thoughts of your own you would like to share.
Yeah, I'm struck by your point about what seems to be driving this seems to be a sense of need for tribalism. Seems to me, I got a dose of this. I had just attended a C.S. Lewis conference, and I was catching a taxi to the train station, and the taxi cab driver asked me what I was here for, and I had said I'd been to a conference, and that was a very good conference, and he just lit into me about how all this, about conferences, and we don't have need for that, and I, of course, I didn't say anything more, but this idea that that people who have knowledge they're excluded from that, and they may not have had a chance to have an education, but that sense of needing to belong and not being disenfranchised is a very powerful force, and that we need to maybe pay more attention to that. I mean, I'm reminded back in the Gnostics, at the beginning of the church, that you had to have special knowledge to be saved. And I'm also struck by that the people who support Trump, it's not so much that they believe in his principles, but they want somebody going up against what they see as the liberal elites, the knowledgeable people. And so that is what's created this. People who have knowledge or institutions are some special class, and they feel left out.
Yeah.
There's always been excuse me. There's always been an anti-intellectual strain in American life, and I remember it came out in the '60s when everything was feeling oriented, and all that, and then it naturally generates resentment against people who are educated. My feeling on all this is, I went to school a lot, and it's a lot of work, and as Grace was saying, you have to deliberate and think, and democracy requires that, but we're not really being conditioned, for that kind of engagement with each other today. I'm off social media. I don't trust any of that stuff. It just distorts reality so much. It makes people so reactive. I don't think it's healthy or good.
I have a couple questions. First of all, we know that at least from an immigrant's perspective, that American essence of America is considered as a big defenders of democracy and human rights to the world. But I do see that there is a thread on those two issues at the current, at least the past couple of years, especially during the Trump's, I hate to say that, but it's true, that is during the Trump administration. So this is one thing. And second, I don't know, you noticed that after the first presidential debate, the two things occur. One was actually Europeans political commentator actually seeing that the debate was truly failure of democracy. They pretty much comments that is that two people dislike each other and do not want to be together in the same room to discuss issues. So they consider it's really truly the failure of democracy. I don't know what you take on. And the other thing was more small. The second thing was that happened after presidential debate was that the second thing was Trump got COVID-19 test positive. So the social media immediately, especially I think it's both Twitter and Facebook, immediately claimed that they would take down all the posts that wish Trump death, remove them on the social media. Then pretty much later, four minority congresswomen that was actually questioned this to social media that they constantly receive death threats on their social media platform, but social media never take any action on those. So this is just a few. Actually, there's more question. I think social media does, when you ask that your presentation, I know you are trying to take a neutral position, but I also feel that we are in a very confusing time. And if there's no clear voice, everyone is in the dark. And of course, the people who are educated or are able to acquire and make a judgment on truth and false, they probably maintain their belief, but have a majority of American audience still in the dark and receiving a lot of false information daily. So that's kind of also very scary. Oftentimes you're receiving false information 100 times, they become a fact, become a truth. And once that become a truth, it's very hard to erase that kind of belief. And that also creates certain dangers of a society of order. And I don't want to go into more like the anti-Asian Americans, a lot of happening lately. But I'm going to just leave that to you, see if you have any take on those.
Grace,
Yeah.
Grace,
Hi, Larry.
Grace, this is Gary. Could you please, this is the last screen that you had on your presentation is monopolizing my screen, and I can't see anybody else except Diana at one person speaking at a time. Could you put away the deep state image that you had? That was the last image of your presentation.
Thanks.
It's monopoly.
I'm trying to do that. I'm not good at this.
Well,
Maybe you can maybe you guys, Jeff or
No,
Peter.
we
No,
can't.
wait. No, I know not you, but Jeff or Peter, maybe you could take me off screen sharing. I don't know how to do this.
Thanks.
I've been trying to do it, but
yeah.
there we go. Thank
There you go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah, I don't know how to do. I'm really trying to read books still, so I'm really a Luddite. Yes, please. But yeah, anyone else have any comments or ideas, questions?
I just think that again emphasizes the point. There's so much information and so much technology. It's overwhelming, so people don't process it. I remember giving a talk once, and I was critiqued for just having too much information. You know, you're only supposed to have 3 points per slide.
Yeah,
And the need to you know, make sense of all the information. I think that may be a factor as well, that people just give up and say, it's more important to belong than to absorb information.
Well, and I think, yeah, that you know, we some of the stories are, like I said, the Columbia Journalism Review. There were 4 or 5 researchers involved with that. They said, internally, the right-wing media, when you and I, if those of us, I don't assume, if those of us who read mainstream media looked at it, we would be shocked. But inherently, it's internally coherent. So it's not unintelligible, right? It's not just random nonsense. It makes sense within itself. I think, yeah, the thing is, going back to Diana, your question was about this generally about information. Like we've always had to trust the scientists, right? I'm a trained political scientist, but I can't tell you about epidemiology. I don't know how to evaluate, right, their information that we should rely on, but I trust them. I trust that they are, doing this not to create some sort of radical new country. I trust that they're doing this for our benefit, so that we don't overwhelm our healthcare system, so that we don't, lose so many lives, because even economists have come out and said, if we lose 1 million people, that has a serious impact on our economy. Where are we going to find people to do certain jobs? Like, these kinds of analysis are based on our trust in that those who are doing the expert work, and nobody's an expert in everything. So we have to trust that they are doing it in good faith and based on their training. But yeah, it's this distrust or mistrust, right, in these institutions that I think are, yeah, really why we're kind of in this situation. So it's this kind of idea that they are doing this against us, right? This idea that our group, for whatever reason, is their target. And this is a little bit of irrationalism. So there's so many dimensions to talking about this issue. The role of these, why certain segments of the population came to distrust institutions of knowledge like science to begin with. I think that is the one, where we can go into questions of irrationalism, and there's a long study of that as well. But I think Diana was talking about the social media, the various representative congressional representatives who have been threatened with violence on their physical selves and their lives. They never had this kind of protection that social media, that Twitter and Twitter and Facebook were going to provide by not permitting wishes of death, for President Trump. So who are these? Why did they get all of this power? And who are they? But in fact, they have a lot of power because so many of us are on social media. So this is the authority now. And who are these people? I want other people to speak. So Susan.
Hi, I hope this isn't tangential. To me, a lot of it goes back to the politics of Karl Rove under G.W. Bush. And that was, I heard, once you introduce emotion into an argument, for a lot of people, once you, or maybe all of us, rationality goes out the window. And I think that this is one of the reasons that the politics have become so divisive, because I think people are manipulated by emotion. And so we don't trust the media. And I think a lot of it has been through slips of things, like having New York Times having had given credence to a reporter that was not qualified and didn't support his story. And they did the same thing to discredit Dan Rather. They disproved his source, but that didn't really disprove his premise that George Bush had not served when he should have. He was not serving. At any rate, I have a cousin who is a staunch Republican who's recently died, but for many years I helped her, and she lived in a retirement community, in La Costa Glen up in Carlsbad. And there was of course a Republican club and a Democratic club up there. And she went with me once because the Democratic club had a speaker who was a retired professor of mathematics, actually, who spoke to the matter of using the arguments to get you to leap into your emotional brain instead of your rational brain. And he had quite a lot of scientific data to support that. That was from various research studies, et cetera. And I think that the whole thing about, the conclusion that he said is that at age 2, you could use the startled response of an infant to predict whether they would become Republicans or Democrats, or liberals. I should say liberals or conservatives, because it wasn't necessarily Republican or Democrat. But since most Republicans are more conservative than Democrats, that's the way it fell out over time. And I'd like to commend that as an area that needs more study and communication. And that's why I think that the media has been perceived as more and more manipulative by most of us.
Grace, this is Gary again. May I just offer another a comment on another dimension? And that is, I think that we are not teaching students and young people critical thinking skills starting at an early age, and then supporting the increase and the ability to use those skills, especially as we critique the social sciences. Critical thinking in the laboratory sciences are well established because you have to have proofs and
Mhm.
corollaries and all of that. But in the social sciences, we need critical thinking. And as has been said many times, people are entitled to their opinions, but not their own set of facts. And I think we need to teach young people how to think critically and have open discussions where they're not attacking each other personally, but considering the facts and alternative views of the facts, and having decent discussions around the critical thinking that needs to go on. That I just offer that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you can definitely see that students, you know, at least at the university level, they come in and they have a certain inclination, political inclination, and so you know, they'll believe anything that satisfies that is consistent with that. So and that can be on any part of the spectrum, political spectrum, left, right, whatever. So one of the things we try to develop more now is experiential learning opportunities, so they can go and you know, talk to the people, you know, work with the people who are involved in the issues that we're discussing, whether it's homelessness or the migrants and asylum seekers, everything like that. So they have a better concept of who, instead of speaking the abstract and referring to different studies with findings that dispute each other, because they're derived from the selective evidence that those authors choose to use to back up their perspective. So maybe we live too much, right? Every time you're with a kid, or one of your, you know, younger members of the family, they're always on social media. You take it away from them, it's like you cut off their arm, right? Like, I mean, live in reality, like have more contact, and having these kinds of experiential learning opportunities. I think we're really trying to develop them for our students, and I think you're absolutely right. Because then they can see, okay, what in this reality contradicts so-called evidence, that then they can say that there is a basis for evidence, right? And we can actually go out and find that. And they trust, you know, develop that trust amongst each other. And yeah, hopefully that's where I think we need to go, so we can break out of these little silos of information and alternative truths.
Grace, we have about, we're a little over time, but I think we can go about 3-4 minutes more. If people need to go, of course, that's fine. I have a question for you, and I think you started to answer it just now. And I have really two questions. I'm gonna try to ask it in one. We're talking about trust in institutions, and I'm wondering about, I really appreciate the model you've given us of different narratives, tribal narratives for different epistemologies. And I'm wondering about perhaps using this analogy in addition to the COVID one of science, which breaks down trust in institutions to handle public health. That, for example, I also have a lack of trust in institutions on the other side when it comes to racism and systemic racism. So I have a deep distrust of institutions when it comes to that I have a feeling on the other side, there's a distrust of my distrust, that there's a belief that the institutions work and that there's nothing broken. Which can be flipped perhaps when it comes to public health. And it seems like in these public narratives, because we live in these bubbles where we can't speak to each other through these bubbles, and we have trouble communicating. What I wanted to ask was what the path forward is. Is it something like the experiential learning that you're talking about, or how do we break through? How do we move forward?
Such a good question. Yeah, I think that's such a good analogy, like the flip side, right? Those of us who think, oh, the institutions have bias, and those who say, where's the evidence for that? That's a really, really good question. I mean, again, I think you need to have people actually speak to each other and experience, what others do. We have really, I think Gary touched upon that, critical thinking. We've really kind of cut back on humanities learning. Everybody should just take whatever courses they want, and they should have lots of choice, and they should learn a skill. A lot of school districts in New York, where I grew up, I know that they actually got rid of not a lot, but a number of them got rid of everything except for reading, writing, and math. Like they thought everything else was too controversial. We had history, we had social studies when we were kids as well. They thought that all of that is controversial, so we're not going to teach that. And so actually, one of the teachers gave the student a speech, actually the Gettysburg Address, and the students were like, what is he talking about? Like, what's going on? Like, if you don't know history, right? If you don't have the background knowledge, reading makes no sense. So this idea that we have just technical, we can just train students for technical tools. We also need to train, you can train people to understand, appreciate, right? Like context, history, and reading literature, I think, is studying history, reading literature about people's experiences, right, is very important. And we've cut back on that so much. Like when you read, when students are in a literature class and they read about experience in a very thorough way. I mean, and they can imagine themselves that way. I think that kind of imagination is very important. So I think part of it is also, there's so many different, as you all have raised, many different elements, right? Many different dimensions that contributed to where we are now. And another part of it, I think, is our educational curriculum. We really devalue these kinds of humanistic studies that help us to gain empathy and want to want to understand who other people are and what they're experiencing, and that there is a diversity of experience. And I've had students, like I told them, there's human trafficking here, and the students like, I've never seen that. So I don't believe it. Like there's students who just, if it's not in their experience, they don't believe it. So they have never been racist towards a Black person. They don't believe there's racism towards Black people, for example. There's students who say that I've never been racist. And I'm not saying you've been racist, but that how did they experience racism, and things like that. So a lot of it is their awareness is limited if they don't have access to understanding the experiences of others, which is, very, very diverse and not easy to say, because there is a great deal, but yeah, I don't know. We can evaluate also our media, what stories our entertainment are telling us, right? Are they telling us about blowing up? Now it's not terrorists, right? Now it's like zombies. Like, do we have stories that convey to us about something that we can experience as fellow human beings versus fantastic, thrillers and what kinds of places does our imagination go? And if social media is the only place for that, then I think we're very limited in our ability to empathize. Susan?
That unconscious prejudice by lack of experiential knowledge, it affects institutions, and they found that with the court system, judges who had never experienced any form, primarily males, I should say, who had never experienced any form of discrimination against them because of either sex or color or gender or something, I don't know. We're much more likely to not fine for defendants who were in cases where they were contesting inequality of pay or position. They would simply did not fine for the defendant.
Yeah. And that speaks to the whole point, right, of empathy and appreciating a diverse set of experiences, right, across our society.
Okay, thank you so much,
Yeah.
Grace, Dr. Chung. And Peter, would you like to close us up and tell us about next week?
Thank you so much, Grace. It was so interesting. Next week, Grace is, I guess her major thing is human rights. And she'll be talking about Mike Pompeo, the President's Secretary of State, having changed, I guess, the parameters of what we're going to endorse in America about what human rights are. And she'll give us a critique of that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's very interesting. It's called the Committee for the Unalienable Rights. Instead of, traditionally we've used inalienable. Why did he choose unalienable, which is a little bit awkward, but it's very, it's an interesting, different perspective on human rights that the administration will try to promote.
Okay.
So thank you all so much for, this is a topic can go all over. So thank you for letting me
Thank you so much.
be on
Very good.
from you. Thank you. Well, have a wonderful day and see you next week.
Okay, you too.
Thank you for the opportunity, everyone.
Thank you.